Hello, hello. We are back. The War of Ideas. Watch the intro. Welcome back to the War of Ideas. Today we have our first revisiting guest, Professor Jonathan Zimmerman. We talked to him last year. I had a different background, a different setup. I was a whole different person. But now we are doing it again, talking about some of the most critical issues, namely culture, education, maybe a little bit of politics and how it plays into that, because unfortunately, politics plays into everything nowadays. For those of you who do not know, Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman is one of the foremost education historians working today. His work examines how education practices and policies have developed over time, the myths that cloud our understanding of teaching and learning, and he has a particular interest in how political and social movements come to shape education. He's a former Peace Corps volunteer, high school teacher. He's written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Review of Books, and The Atlantic. And we are very much graced by his presence. Professor Zimmerman, thank you for showing up and talking to me again. I
Thanks for
appreciate it.
having me.
Yeah. So I guess I'm going to start with an open-ended question, because last time we talked a lot about Florida and we talked a lot about educational standards, and I imagine that we're going to go that way again, at least a little bit. But first, I want to know not just what I think are some of the most important issues in education. I want to know what you think. If you had to pick, two or three of the top issues that are holding education back, or that are you feel like are real problems that need addressing, what's the bird's eye view, big picture things that need to get fixed?
Well, identify a few things. First of all, I think that free speech and open exchange continues to be a huge problem, both at the K through 12 and the higher ed level. I know we covered some of that territory before,
Mhm.
but I think there have been some changes as well. Um, I would also say the whole question of artificial intelligence is becoming ever more insistent,
Yeah, yeah.
right, at every level. Um, uh, and then, I mean, the chronic problem of inequality. The problem that even though our common school system was created to try to give everybody a quote common schooling, we have failed radically to do that. And your zip code has an enormous influence on the quality of education that you receive. And that continues to be a chronic problem.
Okay, so let's take those one at a time very briefly. So free speech, like there's people like me, there's people like the College Fix and Campus Reform, who I'm sure you've read, who will talk about free speech issues on campus and colleges all the time. Is that the type of thing you're talking about, like political bias in universities, or is there something kind of less obvious going on? Would you say?
Well, I mean, bias will always be a problem at every level of education because we're biased as human beings. I don't think there's anything new about that. I think the problem is that since October 7th, I think there's been a radical
Mm,
constriction of free speech on our campuses that doesn't have to do with bias so much as it has to do with rules. Just look at what happened at Barnard College, where the administration said you can't put a political flyer on the door on the door of your dorm room.
mm,
That is outrageous. Or look at American University, where they said that any flyer you distribute on campus has to have the approval of the administration. Really?
yeah,
I
that's
mean, what
insane.
are we teaching people with things like that? So it's not just a matter of bias, right? It's actually a matter of rulemaking and the constricting of every kind of speech. And let me be clear, um, everyone is implicated in this. It's not just a question of, the bias of Republicans. One of the things I keep telling audiences is that when it comes to free speech, we're all Marxists now. And I'm not referring to Karl Marx. I'm referring to a much more important Marx in my family lineage. That, of course, would be Groucho Marx, who famously said, my favorite Groucho quote, if you don't like my principles, I've got others. So, John, everyone is being radically unprincipled at this particular moment when it comes to free speech. So, post October 7th, the same Republicans that were complaining about cancel culture on campus and were saying that it's invidious to free speech, they're asking for rules to limit speech they call anti-Semitic. Meanwhile, the people on the left who said that speech is violent and we have to protect minorities from it, Now they've gone all ACLU on us, and they're like, from the river to the sea, we've got to protect that. And by the way, we do have to protect that. They're
Right.
right about that, right?
Only by
But
accident,
but
not on
they're
principle.
but they're radically inconsistent because that's precisely the kind of speech that some people interpret as violent and that they were demanding the restriction of in the pre-October 7th era.
Right.
I understand why people object to From the River to the Sea, and I understand why some people think it's violent. I don't think that's a good reason to censor it. But you would imagine that the people on the left who are demanding appropriately the protection of that speech might want to go backwards and ask themselves how they've contributed to the restriction of speech by imagining speech as violent. But no, you can't do that, right? We're all Marxists now.
So I actually agree with you. I actually think From the River to the Sea, I think there's colorable arguments that it's actually technically speaking a call for violence and therefore not protected by free speech. However, ultimately, I don't buy the argument. I think it's somewhat reasonable, but I don't personally believe it. But in order to play, so you don't think it's credible at all.
Well,
Uh,
no, I mean, it depends what you mean by
it-
credible. Like is it credibly a call for violence against Jews? Sure. I can imagine many people hearing that as a call for violence against Jews. But the way it works, or the way it's supposed to work, is it's not enough for you or me or some administrator or some politician to deem a statement violent. If you actually want to restrict it, you have to show that it poses an immediate and direct physical threat to
right,
other human beings. And that's preposterous. It does not.
right. It's not that it's not that you can have one credible interpretation that would make it violent. It would be this is the only interpretation of this statement is that it has to
Right,
be a
right.
call
And
for
I
violence.
mean, I would try to be a little bit more precise. This is not a matter of interpretation. This is a matter of context. That is, does the statement at the time it's made represent a direct and tangible and physical threat to other people? That's a
Right.
context specific question. And that entire context is now getting lost. People just say, oh, that's violent. We have to get rid of it.
Yeah.
That's absurd. What other things are you going to get rid of?
Right. No, and I agree. I'm a pretty big free speech guy, but I'm going to do something difficult and play a little bit of devil's advocate with you. I want to see
Sure,
what
which
you
I appreciate.
do. So,
Yeah.
a big part of education is free speech and the exchange of ideas. However, the argument that I've been most sympathetic to from my friends on the left is like, look, free speech is important. However, if this type of free speech that you're engaging in is the type of stuff that makes a significant amount of people reasonably afraid or like reasonably uncomfortable, like if you have to walk down the hall and every door has let's say missing Israeli posters, like you have to walk that gauntlet, or it's river to the sea posters and you're like a Jewish person, that is also massively detrimental to education because you feel unsafe and you need safer or at least like baseline safe environments in order to have genuine free expression and not self censor out of a place of fear. That is the I don't agree with this argument, but it's the most empathetic one that I've heard so far. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Look, I think the people that make that argument make it from good faith and for
Hmm.
empathetic reasons. I don't question their good faith, right? They're just wrong, right? I'm not saying they're bad
Always the
people,
issue, isn't it?
right?
Yeah.
But this is absurd, right? Because who's going to determine what is so unsafe that it can't be said or heard? I don't trust administrators or
Polls?
politicians enough to do that, and I don't see why anybody else should. Also, the same people who are demanding those kinds of restrictions, they rarely look backwards in time to see how often those restrictions have been weaponized against them.
Right.
And that's what the river to the sea thing is all about, right? It's suddenly people on the left saying, holy shit, they're trying to censor us, which, by the way, they are. They're not wrong about that,
Yeah,
right?
correct.
They're
Yeah.
doing it on exactly the same grounds that the left was engaging in censorship. That's the whole point.
Yeah. One of the other big issues that you were talking about was inequality. There was a second one, but I thought the inequality one was more interesting. Um, yeah, so public schools are of varying qualities, but something, and I'm sure you're aware of this, like New York City has some of the worst test results, despite like spending, I don't know, something like the most amount of money per student in their public school system. They spend oodles and oodles of money, but they're not super getting results. So this is a setup to a question, which is how would you fix the inequality of the quality of public school systems if it doesn't seem to be at least directly or primarily attached to just how much gets spent?
Okay, I mean, obviously
Or
we
you
could
can reject
spend.
my premises as well,
No,
please.
no, no, I don't reject the premises. If the premise is money is not the only problem, the premise is true. If the
Okay,
premise is money is not a problem, the premise is false,
okay,
right? Again, we've got to make distinctions here, right? Is this simply a problem of money? Of course not. I haven't seen the numbers on New York, but I have seen the numbers on Washington, right? Because they get money from the federal government,
mhm,
right? Um, and significantly more because it's it's a district of the feds. Um, uh, has that solved the problem of underperforming public schools in Washington, D.C.? It has not, right?
yeah,
But at the same point, we absolutely know that money matters, right? Let's just give a really, really tangible example. One of the things that's happened since the early 2000s is that a lot of public school districts have either radically minimized or gotten rid of art and music as foci of instruction.
mhm,
Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but the big one has to do with money. That's expensive, and they are under pressure to raise test scores in reading and math. So there's a logic to it, right? But would anybody at a leafy public suburban school, would they either accept would they accept that? We're not going to have art and music in our school? They would not accept it, nor should they. None of us should. Art and music is absolutely integral to our development as human beings. And all of us as citizens should be embarrassed and outraged that only some kids have access to that and others don't. That's not acceptable, at least not to me. I mean, if there's a defense of it, I'd like to hear it, but it doesn't seem defensible to me.
I'll offer the devil's advocate because that's what I'm doing for a second. I mean, again, I would like to preface with I agree. I think that children who are citizens of the United States do have a right to basic education, and to your point, education isn't just for what helps you get jobs like science and math. Well, that's a huge part of it. But especially K through 12 at that age, yeah, it's about culturing you, it's about civilizing you, and that involves art and music. So I agree. But the idea of public school wasn't that it is a federal level thing and that it's a locale level thing. And if you really wanted to get cynical, you'd argue actually it's good. Actually, if there's certain areas of the country where test scores are really low, it's actually good that they can make those micro adjustments and pour more of their focus into the more essential things. While other areas where their test scores are fine, it's good that they don't have to have that level of hyper focus and that they've done the basics well enough that they get to have the fun art stuff as
Okay,
well.
but why are the reading and math scores so low in the first example and
That's a
higher
really
in
good
the second?
question. That's a
Right?
really good
And that
question.
has to do with money. Absolutely. Think
I'm
about
You
class
really think so?
size, right? It's true that if you reduce class size from 40 to 35, you don't see a lot of effects. And by the
Mhm.
way, California spent a lot of money doing something like that, and it wasn't a good use of money.
No.
But you reduce class size from 30 to 15 or to 12, you see huge effects.
Yeah.
This is what the Tennessee Star things were about. And it's very hard to show things in educational research, but this seems to be one of the things they've shown. And
Right.
it's important too, because what it suggests is that if you want to do what LA did, which is trying to bring it down from 40 to 35, that's actually not a good use of money,
Totally useless, yeah.
right? But going down to 15, it is. Who gets the classes with 15? People in general that live in more affluent communities. I don't see how that's justifiable,
Well,
right?
I think
Um,
it's affluent communities, but it would also explain why you said LA, it would also explain New York as well, is that they're just so goddamn population dense, right?
Right,
Um, yeah,
of course. But again, this is a rich country, despite what you might have heard on TV,
I
right?
don't know. We're like
We
trillions of dollars in debt, so I
Yeah, I mean, look, we
know
have
what
the
you mean.
highest performing economy in the world. It's, by the way, performed better than most other economies, COVID and post-COVID.
Mhm.
I could demonstrate that in 50 different ways, right? This is a political question, right? When anybody says we don't have the money, they're lying. We do have the money. The political question is how to allocate it. It's not that we don't have it, right? We have it. The question is how to allocate it, right? In the 1950s, which a lot of conservatives look at as this sort of heyday of American democracy and capitalism, the tax rate on the richest Americans was like 80 or 90%. Now
Right.
it's 30, right? And again, it's perfectly reasonable to debate what that marginal tax rate should be. And again, I don't question the motives or the reason of the people that disagree with me on that. The only reason I offer it as an example is it shows you that this is always a political matter,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
We had lots of resources then, we have lots of resources now, right? What we've done is we've chosen to allocate them in different ways. That's a political decision.
Sure. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea of lower class sizes for sure. Um, I would say that while the country might be rich, individual school districts might not be. So, I mean,
That's
so
my
would
point,
so
right?
would
Where,
would
where, where
school
does the
would
money come
you
from? It comes still largely from property taxes, and
right,
property taxes yield different sums depending
right.
on the value of the property.
So what's the solution there? Because if you get into a situation where you generalize it, right, where like everybody in the state, like you're equaling out schools, I don't know if that is super good. I'm sorry. I should just let you answer.
No, no. Look, these are hard questions, right?
Yeah.
There are no simple solutions to them. And by the way, I should tell you, I'm not an expert on this. The real expert is my doctoral student, Angus MacLeod, who
Yeah.
is about to start teaching in Amherst College, and he
Right.
just finished a dissertation
Like
on the history of school
like
funding.
the concern is right. Like if the rich, so like if the rich areas do not get to see the benefit of their wealth for their students' education, and it all gets homogenized across a large area, then like I know that as if I was a wealthy parent, I would just pull my money out of the system and throw them in a private school.
And look, I mean, this is an erstwhile problem. This happened in
Yeah.
California several decades ago, where
Oh,
basically
really?
they said, oh yeah, they said if you tax yourself above a certain amount, a fraction of that is going to go back to the state, right?
Hmm.
And lo and behold, people stopped taxing themselves to that amount,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because they didn't want their money going to another place. Look, that's a real question. And again, it's a question that transcends education, right? I mean, this is just a basic question in a democracy. Okay. Not just democracy, by the way, but it's a basic question for all democracies, which is who gets what and who decides who gets what. Um, and look, it's also true that, and Angus's work shows this, across time, especially the past 30 years, the state has picked up a growing fraction of the education dollar. The federal contribution has remained fairly static. It's about 10 or 12%. But even though localities are still the primary source of educational funding, they're not as they're not as dominant as they used to be. That is, the fraction that the state is picking up has gone up. Again, people can disagree about that too, but I just think it's important to note that that's where the trend line is going.
Right, and that is important to note. There's another aspect here, though, that's definitely, as you say, it kind of transcends education itself. And this is my pet theory and the pet theory of a lot of, at least, cultural conservatives, who you referenced earlier, which is that maybe the problem with education and test scores isn't really about the school itself, and it's about the basic stuff like family stability and that type of thing, because there's a traditional idea that I feel like modernists and people who are more on the liberal bent are going for, that education is primarily the onus of the state. While if you're much more traditional, you'd say, well, no, really, education is holistic. The civilization of children is holistic, and it's primarily on the parents actually, and they outsource it to the schools for specific things like STEM and math and maybe some art. And when you look at it that way, I suppose my thought is maybe like just the super high divorce rates have a lot to do with education issues, and lack of stability at home has a lot to do with education issues. And no matter how small class sizes get, if kids are coming from unstable homes, it's not going to matter if they don't have mom and dad at home helping them with homework. So like, I don't, that might be outside of our field that might be outside of our
No,
field
no,
of
it's
thinking
not. It's
at
not.
all.
I mean, look, um, schools are not magicians.
Yeah.
And to your point, schools are not the only institution that educates.
Yeah.
Obviously, families are the primary educator. There's no question about that, right?
Well, there's a question
But
for a lot of people, so I'm glad that you agree, but
well,
there's
no,
definitely
of
people who
course it
disagree.
is, right? And you can show it empirically, right? I mean, just how much influence the family has. But to your point about outsourcing, schools have always existed to do things that families can't or won't do, right? I mean, if I could teach my kids the quadratic equation, I wouldn't have to send them to school to have them learn
Right,
it,
right.
right? And there are some things I could teach them for sure, but it's not that. My wife could. But since the very beginning, that's why schools exist. So, if you look at the very first education law that was passed in Puritan New England, it's called the Old Deluder Satan Law, which is a great name, by the way. We don't name them like they like now. We have anodyne names like Every Student Succeeds or No Child Left Behind. The Old Deluder Satan Law that had teeth. And the reason it's called that is the preamble says, like, given the old deluder Satan is like messing with our minds and always trying to tempt us into sin, all right, we need schools. Now, why do we need schools? Here's
True.
what it was: we need schools so we can learn to read the Bible. And this is what the old deluder Satan law said: if you're teaching your kids to read the Bible, you're good. But if you're not, you have to send them to school. What's the moral of the story? Schools compensate for what families don't do. It's
Exactly.
true that the content has changed over time, right? Obviously,
Yep.
we don't teach the Bible as a sacrament in schools anymore. We do teach the quadratic equation, right? And I
Mhm.
think the reason we teach it is we understand that most people aren't going to teach their kids the quadratic equation. So, of course, schools compensate where families don't or can't do, right?
Yeah.
But to your other point, families have different capacities for sure. Look at all the research about vocabulary knowledge,
Yeah.
right? Even
Yeah.
at the age of 1, right? It's radically different. Okay. And the reasons for that, they're not hard to find, right? In poor families, people are less likely to have books. They're more likely to work at night. They're more likely to be raising a kid by themselves. All
Yep.
those things are real. But to me, that actually makes school more important. I'm not saying that school has the ability to compensate for all of that. I'm saying what those facts do is I think that raises the bar for schools and should, right? It is not the fault of a 1 year old that their vocabulary load is lower than some other 1 year olds. It is not their fault.
Yep.
Nobody will ever show me that it is, right? If you
Right.
want to blame their parents, go ahead, right? I may not agree with that either, but I'll listen. I will not listen to somebody that blames them. I will not, right?
Yeah.
It is
I'm
not
yeah.
their fault, right?
Yeah.
And so the only interesting question is what to do about that.
I know, it's a great question.
Yeah,
I have not met anybody who is blaming the one-year-old. If I meet
I
him,
have.
I'll punch him in the mouth for you. But,
Yeah.
blaming the parents seems appropriate,
By the
at
way,
least
racist theories of development blame the 1 year old essentially.
that's insane.
Right,
Yeah,
and sexist
it's,
ones too,
yeah. I
right? I mean,
suppose that
that's
does
just
exist.
that's a blaming system, right?
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
historic in our nation, right? I mean, right? So that's
Both.
all real.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I suppose. Um,
yeah,
but yeah, to your point, I mean, there's some things you can do about it. I mean, there's like, no, I mean, there's other issues like no fault divorce. There's issues like incentivization of family care. There's lots of pro family policies that one can like think of like off the top of your head.
yes,
And I
and
agree that
also
it's no
yeah,
excuse to slouch off school. My point is just you don't want to be banging your head against the wall. Ultimately, as you say, school can compensate, but only so much. And my point is only
right,
that at a
right.
certain point, it's not it's you got to look over at the more fundamental stuff. And I think we agree on that.
And sure, and look, the ghost of James Coleman is looming over all this. So
Mhm.
most people in America don't know that name anymore. My students certainly don't, but I think he's absolutely critical to this discussion. So in the mid '60s, the Great Society hired Coleman to prove they hoped that if we poured more money into schools, achievement would go up. And
Yeah.
so what he tried to do was show that, and he failed. He said that wasn't the relevant variable. The relevant variable was the social class of the parents who attended the school. And by that, he meant generally, basically, two things: their income level and their education level. So that's what determined the school outcomes. It wasn't the amount of money that the feds or anybody else pumped into the school. But here's the thing about social science, right? The implications are never as clear as the findings, right?
Mm.
So On the right, people read the Coleman report and they said, this means we shouldn't throw money at school, because that's what we liberals are always doing, just throwing money. Or to we're throwing money, right?
I wouldn't
But
say you personally.
on the left, people interpreted it differently. They said, you know what? Coleman's right. And this is why we need to equalize incomes, right? He's making an argument for socialism. And again, you can do with that what you will, right? And I'm
Yeah,
not saying either side was right here. And I think they were probably both right and wrong in different ways,
yeah,
right? But the point is, the numbers never speak for themselves. I think the Coleman report was hugely important. But my point here is that people were able to reasonably interpret it in different ways based on their politics.
sure. And I think, some interpretations are more reasonable than others, but yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
Raw data is just raw data. It doesn't give you conclusions.
Yeah, and look,
Conclusions,
I mean, it
policy
does to a point,
prescriptions,
right?
and
I mean, it
political.
did
Yeah.
Coleman did give a conclusion. His
Oh,
conclusion
he did.
was adding more money to these schools isn't gonna affect achievement. But I think where you get into the interpretation part is, okay, so what do you do with that finding?
Right. Yeah. This
Yeah,
is something that we've been confused about, especially over the last 4 years with COVID. It's like the science and the data and the numbers aren't the same thing as policy prescriptions. You
right,
cannot transfer the objectivity of the scientific method and data analysis and like pretend like your policy prescriptions are just as objective. Your policy
yeah,
prescriptions are not the science, but they are
right,
based on science. Um,
correct,
and
correct.
that
No,
doesn't and that's
I
not
think
me
that's a good
saying
point.
like all restrictive COVID policies were bad, although some of them were.
Yeah,
It's just to
yeah.
say that these are different categories, and
Right. And just because you
I'm formally
understand,
yeah.
right, just because
It's
you
a conflation.
understand
It's a
something about the transmission of the virus doesn't mean you're going to construct, a useful or efficacious policy based on
right.
that knowledge.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's a political conflation to try to, like, just bolster your own legitimacy. It's just a rhetorical trick,
Uh,
which I'm formally educated in rhetoric, so this kinda stuff gets my gears going when I notice,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
little
yeah,
little
yeah,
things.
yeah.
Yeah, but so here's something to run by you. Homeschooling and charter schooling has been, like, way more popular, especially where I'm from originally, which is, like, northern, like, rural-ish California, where charter schools
Whereabouts are you from? Up like towards Eureka?
yeah, yeah, I'm even north of
Yeah.
that. I'm not gonna dox myself with the Pacifics, but very top of
You're
the
in the
valley.
redwoods. Yeah,
Up yeah, yeah, right
yeah.
up there, yeah,
Nice.
yeah. Center top of the valley for sure.
Oh, beautiful.
And
Yeah.
beautiful spot, but also tons of charter schools. All of the friends from back home that I still have today are, like, charter school and homeschool guys. So I'm curious for your thought on that because I know that some people on the left will, not like that because they think it's backwards and, it's preventing unity of our civilization or something. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, do you think are homeschools viable? Like, where are the regulations around them? Give me your general take, I
Well,
suppose.
homeschooling and charter schooling are very different in my mind, right?
Okay,
To
well,
your
let's
point,
start
they
there.
need obviously. I think in each case they can represent dissatisfaction with the quote regular public schools, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But as policy solutions, they're very different, and here's why. Um, Charter schools are called charter schools because they're chartered by the state,
Mhm.
right? And regulated by the state. This is why I object to a lot of the language of critics of charter schools calling it privatization. It's true that they're privately operated, but they are not privately funded, and they are not even privately organized. They are paid for with state dollars, and they are regulated by the state. This idea that you could just hang up a shingle and have a charter school is totally false. But
Right.
here's what you can do: you can hang up a shingle and teach your own kid. And
Yeah.
in a majority of states in America, that's totally unregulated.
Mm,
This is how charters and homeschooling are different. So, John, let me give you an analogy that I've used in print.
mm.
Do you own an automobile?
No,
Okay,
I did.
good for you, by the way. But I do, and every year I have to get it inspected. I
Mhm.
don't like that. It's a pain in the butt. Often the mechanics find things I have to correct. Um, uh, but even though it's a pain in the butt, I accept it. And I accept this process. Why? Well, I think it's pretty obvious what the theory is. The theory is that we all share the road, right? And so it's legitimate for the state to make sure that your car is safe, because this isn't just about you, it's about all of us. So, how could it be reasonable for the state to require you to have your car inspected and corrected, but not reasonable for the state to review what you're doing as a homeschooling instructor. Now, to be clear, there are some states that do that, right? There are, kids get tested. Sometimes there has to be home visits, but a majority of them, man, nobody's watching the store.
Yeah.
I don't think that's legitimate. I'm not contesting, by the way, the right of parents to school their kids, which I support.
Yeah.
What I am contesting is the right of them to do it in a completely unregulated fashion.
I'm actually sympathetic to this. I mean, if it were me and I was, God emperor of my state, I would like, have some every year or two, just have like some tests that evaluate where the kid is at. And if the kid is hitting basic
Right.
marks, then it's fine. And if they're
Which
not,
some states
then
do, by the way.
yeah,
Just not
that
enough
seems
though.
like the most non-intrusive way to make sure that kids aren't being like robbed of basic education.
I
So
Yeah.
and I mean, I like the ideas as well. It's very actually it's super funny and interesting to me that like charter schools are basically the only way they're different from public schools is that like they're privately like organized and like operated. And that's interesting. Do you know the data off the top of your head on like the success rate of charter schools and like their statistics
Okay,
as opposed to
here's
public
what you
schools?
gotta know, John. All
Yeah.
right? Back to the
No.
question of politics and data. This is really
Oh,
important.
I guess that's
There
true.
are now, like, I think almost 10,000 charter schools. You have to check this.
Mhm.
All right? What that means is this: any American who makes a blanket statement about charter schools are X, either, good, awful, fantastic, terrible. If they're making a blanket statement about them, you should immediately write them off as cranks and charlatans, right? It's a ridiculous thing, right? Journalists call me up and they ask me what I think of charter schools. And I'm like, what do you think of water? Like, what do you think of air? I mean, there's good air and bad air, right? There's
Yeah.
good water and bad water, right? And what the data shows is there's some charter schools that have been radically successful and have hugely outperformed what we would predict based on the Coleman-esque,
Mhm.
data about the social, the socioeconomic level of the students. And then there are others that have been awful and corrupt, right? Despite the efforts of regulators, corrupt in the sense that the charter school operators have basically used these things to line their pockets.
Is
Probably
there a failure mechanism?
some of the ones that Betsy DeVos supported in
Mhm.
Michigan were in that category. And in my view, enemies of charter schools unfairly use those charters as, let's just say, representatives of the entire industry.
Mm.
I mean, it is ironic because DeVos was so hot on, charters and different kinds of choice that the one feedback turned out to be horrible, right? But again, you can find wonderful ones too, and that's my point.
Right. Is there I mean that is one of the problems. This is a problem with public schools as well. I mean it's just a problem when you don't have a market doing it. Which this isn't to say that all schools should be private, although there's an interesting argument for that. It's just that there's no failure conditions, right? Like if you're
Yes.
propped up by the state, you're propped up by the taxes and you're not doing well. Like if you're a business, you just fail. The good ones survive and the other
Right.
ones don't. It's just a
But John, it's super
yeah.
complicated, right? And this is the
I am
whole
aware it's super complicated.
school closing question, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at cities like Chicago and New York, which you referenced earlier, right?
Mhm.
When figures like Joel Klein and Rahm Emanuel tried to close schools that they said were radically underperforming in every way they could measure, they got a huge amount of pushback. And a lot of people said, okay, the test scores are low, but, my uncle went there and my cousin works in the cafeteria and like this is our place. And again, I'm not saying they were right or wrong,
Yeah.
but that too speaks to, I think, a really important historical point about American education that we were alluding to earlier is that historically, a little less so now, but still, clearly, they were locally constituted. So, in most parts of America, school was the only public building for
Mhm.
sometimes dozens of years. So school was not just the place where like you sent your kids to learn the alphabet. It was the place where there were, holiday parties and there were funerals and weddings and dances and voting, right? School is us. So if you tell somebody that their local school sucks, the way they're going to hear it is, I suck. And that's the whole school closing dilemma. And again, I'm not taking a position on that because I
Right.
think that some of those schools should have been closed, but I also sympathize with the parents that didn't want them closed.
Right. No, I mean, I can sympathize as well. Yeah, it does pose problems. It's a weird Frankenstein's monster. So I guess, I don't have the answer, so I guess I'll ask you,
Yeah,
as we come to the close of
I
our
don't
show.
either. Right.
No, no, you
But
gotta
I
solve
just
this. You gotta
Yeah,
solve
I
this in the
just
next 5 minutes.
hopefully what I can do through history is kind of frame what I think the important questions are, right? How
Yeah.
much authority should localities have? How much authority should parents have? Right? I don't know the answers to that either, but hopefully history can help us at least ask the right questions.
Well, how do you manage, simulating basically market failure in schools when you get that kind of pushback? Like, how do you do that?
Well, see, here's the problem with metaphors like market failures. I mean, they all
It's rough.
they all rely on an imperfect analogy between businesses and schools, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and this is an enormous problem with all the rhetoric around education reform, is we imagine schools are like businesses. Here's the thing, John. If you sell widgets, you have an absolutely perfect measure of your success. And that measure is how many widgets have you sold, right? How many people bought them, right? Did they continue to buy them?
Yep.
Did the cost of you producing the widgets, right? Was it less than what you generated when you sold them?
Yeah. No, this is my point.
Schools
It's very
schools are
difficult
not
to
like
simulate.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So even market failure, I'm not really comfortable with the metaphor because I just don't think it describes what schools do.
Well, they provide a service, and the service can be measured in terms of test scores, and customer satisfaction can be measured by parents sending their kids there or trying to send school vouchers. We should talk about school vouchers actually, because I
Yeah,
like those. But I think that there are things you can do to measure the success or failure of a school, maybe not as perfectly as a widget
absolutely.
factory.
It's just
Um,
different from
and
measuring the success
no,
of the widget
that's my
factory.
point. I know it's
Yeah,
different, and
yeah,
that's kind of the problem, actually,
yeah,
that it seems
yeah,
difficult to simulate the
yeah,
kind of organic selecting out of the things that work and the things that don't.
yeah.
But school vouchers seem like reasonably useful. I kind of like the idea of giving parents more authority over their children's education, having the money follow the student, not the school, especially if the school is just like a money pit that's not functioning. And it kind of creates like an ability for demand to shift, at least, because when you're in your locales, demand is like static regardless of whether or not the school is doing its job, but school vouchers allow for demand to be reactive to quality. So all of that stuff seems interesting to me and
It is
nice to me.
interesting,
I'm curious what you
and
think about
and I think we've had school vouchers experiments in this country.
that.
The results are very mixed. Again, I would encourage you and your listeners to write off anybody who makes a singular statement about that research. I think my understanding of this is extremely mixed, as is the research around, say, countries like Chile, which under the influence of Milton Friedman actually went to a national voucher system.
Huge.
Very mixed, yeah, very mixed results. This is during the Pinochet era. Um, but that being said, um, uh, let me emphasize that history here matters because believe it or not, if you go backwards in time, the advocates for a quote voucher system, and I'll say more about that in a second, included names like Liz Warren, Jonathan Kozol, and Christopher Jenks. Yes, but they wanted a very different kind, and this is what it looked like. The vouchers got distributed in a progressive manner. By progressive, I mean small p, right? Based on people's needs. So the
Mhm.
way it worked is, if you were extremely poor, you would get a voucher that would have enough purchasing power to send you to Andover, right? And if you're the kind of person who patronizes Andover, right, and pays full freight, your voucher would be very small. You know what? I'd support that voucher system. I honestly would. Don't hold your breath for it. Because
Yeah,
I would argue that, frankly, in the political realm, a lot of the voucher talk is just a way to elide the fundamental inequalities. It's like, let's just pretend that if we give everybody $8,000, it'll all be equal because people will use their $8,000 to patronize the really good schools, right? They won't patronize the really bad schools. Look, if you gave poor people $80,000 and rich people $500, sign me right up. That would be a really interesting experiment, right? But this one is essentially a way to pretend and wish away all the fundamental inequalities in not just our school system, but our society, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we even
maybe.
even conservatives, I think most of them don't think we should tax people at exactly the same rate.
No, of
I
course
think,
not.
right? So why can the vouchers be distributed at exactly the same rate? That doesn't make any sense to me. But
Well,
again,
the
I'm
answer,
open to it. I'm open to
yeah.
it.
Well, I'll explain why the logic makes sense to me in our last couple minutes here, which is that it's not like the poor, like when your locale locked and everybody in the area goes to the same public school. It's not that the kids from poor families get more money poured into them by the school. They don't get like better textbooks or like more tutoring.
Yes.
It's not it's not like it's not the school. It's not the school district just giving you money just because. And to it's not even necessarily to get rid of inequalities. That's not the point. The point is just the money that the district was going to spend on your kid's education, which is equal for every kid, because otherwise we're spending more on some kids other than others. That's just not what we do so far. We're just placing it in your hands so you can go and take that money where you think it's best, as
Yeah,
opposed to
but
the
again, we do spend more on some kids than others, right?
do.
Not within a school, but across schools,
I
right?
see. Yeah, that's
Right.
true.
That's my
But
point.
within a school, but as
Yeah.
far as school vouchers go, like the principal said,
Yes.
that was always my understanding. I never saw it as like trying to eliminate inequality so much as just trying to create competition between schools to raise the quality of schools
And look,
overall.
I'm open to that. Like
Yeah,
I'm a thousand flowers bloom guy, like 100%, right? You know, like it seems to me that in American education, if you want to oppose a certain reform, the onus is on you to show that what might obtain is worse than what we already have. And I think in most circumstances, if we're talking about the poorest schools, that's an almost impossible
so
burden,
that's so
right?
interesting.
So,
I'm so
so
the other way.
you,
Um,
you, you know, so let's give it a try, right? But again, let's be honest about it as well, you
sure.
know, you know, not through all
Honesty and
this.
political promises, you're never getting that. Sorry. I think
Well,
you're gonna get a lot of over promising.
yeah, right. I mean, on every side. But look, before we go, let me just say one other thing about these different choice mechanisms. Even though I'm open to them, right, as experiments, I think we have to be much clearer and more honest about the outcome of those experiments, which thus far have been very mixed.
Hmm.
Um, and note I said mixed, not good or bad, because they're mixed.
Yep.
But secondly, you know, there's something else we haven't talked about, and I know we're almost out of time, but you know, there's a political consideration here about the way that we socialize citizens. And this is how it goes. If everybody gets a choice, what's going to happen, I fear, is that we'll create bubbles of the like minded. Now, we already live in bubbles of the like minded. And
Yeah.
my fear is that we will make them even more bubbly. That can't be good for our democracy, right? It can't be good for everybody who believes in X proposition and disbelieves in Y proposition to all send their kids to the same school. Now, again, there are people who have studied this, some people who claim that isn't what's happened at these schools thus far, and they could be right. But you know, in Western Europe, in most democracies, right? I mean, they essentially have voucher systems. They don't call them that. But like in Holland, you can take the money from the state and you can use that to patronize like a fundamentalist Christian school or an Orthodox Islamic school.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, thanks to certain Supreme Court cases, we may be moving in a similar direction here in the United States. That's a whole other conversation. But I think the broader thing that worries me is I do believe we live in an extremely polarized moment.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of these choice mechanisms as threatening to exacerbate that polarization rather than to diminish it.
I understand that danger. I take a bit of a bit different tact, which is that the polarization is happening whether or not, and it can happen through a big sort where people go get to run their own lives, or there's battlegrounds where we're locked into the same box, cats in a bag, fighting over the same shared institution, throwing principle to the wind to do it. And I think I hate both of those options. I rather us not get polarized. But the issue is deeper than that education. And I
Oh,
prefer a big sort than a, rage cage match, I suppose.
No, 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 no. Look, I agree with that, but it seems to me that there's no way, there's no solution I can see to the polarization problem that
Mhm.
doesn't at some level involve education. And the reason is that education
100%.
is the public institution that we've created to socialize citizens. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying, and this sort of brings us full circle, I'm not saying that schools are either to blame for this or they're the solution for this, because they're neither. But they've got to be part of the solution. To be more precise, I can't imagine a solution that doesn't involve them.
Professor Zimmerman, thank you very much.
Thank
Great
you.
talk.
That was
Great
really
talk.
fun.
Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. You
Everybody.
asked him. You're good at this, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Keep doing it. Yeah, I do so many of these things, and I have a very acute sense of who's good at it. Because one of the things I like about what you do, John, is you're very transparent about where you're coming from, and I actually think that makes for a more effective interview than people that will sort of pretend that they're standing on Mount Olympus and they're sort of above the fray. I
Yeah.
think that tends to make sort of boring interviews.
Hmm.
So I notice and I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your appreciation.
Yeah,
Do my best.
yeah,
Honesty is my policy, so
yeah.
I'm glad it works for you. Hopefully,
Good.
it works for all of you in the audience. If it does, hit the like button. It looks like this. It's not that hard. Hit the subscribe button as well. Professor Zimmerman deserves it. One might argue I deserve it.
As does Dr. Parker. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
doctor. Thank you very
Okay.
much for coming on,
All
as
right.
always. Maybe we'll do a third one in another year. We'll see, but
I
it's
hope
always
so.
a pleasure.
All right.
All
Thanks
right.
again.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye bye.
See you all next time on the War of Ideas. Bye.